In the spring of 1942, the war at sea was balanced on a knife edge. Britain, battered yet unbroken, clung to survival through the lifeline of Atlantic convoys, slow, vulnerable merchant ships bringing oil, grain, munitions, and hope. But across the cold northern waters, hidden deep within Norway's fjords, lurked a single threat capable of shaking that lifeline to its core. The German battleship Tirpitz, sister to the sunken Bismarck, was more than steel and firepower. She was a symbol, a dark, brooding presence whose mere existence forced the Royal Navy to divert ships, aircraft, and thousands of men simply to watch her. She seldom fired a shot, yet she shaped strategy across entire oceans. Winston Churchill himself put it starkly: "The whole strategy of the war turns at this period on this ship." The Admiralty feared a scenario that would haunt them for months. Tirpitz breaking into the Atlantic, annihilating convoys at will, then slipping away to safety. And there was only one place she could be repaired quickly enough to remain an active threat: the Normandy dry dock at Nazaire on France's Atlantic coast, a colossal structure capable of housing the largest ship afloat. It was a chilling thought. If Tirpitz could strike and run, she could prolong the war, drain Britain's strength, and perhaps close the very artery Britain depended on to live. To the Germans, the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire was a fortress. Its walls were concrete and steel. Its U-boat pens, roofed with 11 feet of reinforced armour, were considered bomb-proof. Coastal guns, anti-aircraft batteries, searchlights, minefields, and thousands of troops guarded its perimeter. Admiral Karl Dönitz himself had visited the base only a day before the raid, satisfied that it was all but invulnerable. The Kriegsmarine believed the dock to be untouchable, a target only a fool would attempt. But desperation breeds ingenuity. Throughout late 1941, a quiet unease had grown inside Britain's Naval Intelligence Division. The threat of Tirpitz was stretching the Royal Navy thin. Some officers feared that unless the dry dock was put out of action, the Atlantic campaign could collapse before Britain regained its strength. Bombing the dock was impossible. The German defences shrugged off everything the Royal Air Force attempted. A naval bombardment was suicide. Saboteurs could not hope to reach the heavily controlled port. It was a problem without a solution, until Combined Operations Headquarters, under the youthful and energetic Lord Louis Mountbatten, proposed something audacious, something unthinkable: a destroyer, disguised as a German ship, packed with explosives. Ram it straight into the dock gate. It sounded mad, but it was the only plan with any chance of working. In early March 1942, after heated debate inside the Admiralty, the operation was approved. Volunteers were sought, men who understood the odds and stepped forward anyway. The aging World War I-era destroyer HMS Campbeltown, once USS Buchanan, was chosen for the task. She was obsolete, worn, and outmatched in every conventional sense. But for this one mission, she would become a Trojan horse. Over 9 frantic days, shipyard workers transformed her. Guns were removed, armour plates bolted on, splinter mattresses lashed to her decks. Most distinctive of all, her 4 funnels were cut down to 2 and angled just so, giving her the silhouette of a German Mo-class torpedo boat. And deep inside her bow, behind layers of concrete, lay 4.5 tons of hidden explosives, set on a delayed fuse, designed to detonate hours after she struck the gate. Men who saw the refit whispered grimly, this was a ship with no return journey, a destroyer sent not to fight, but to die. Thus began the daring plan known as Operation Chariot. To halt a battleship that had never left harbour, the Royal Navy prepared a raid no sane commander would attempt, and no enemy would believe possible. The stage was set, the dock was waiting, and HMS Campbeltown would soon begin her final voyage. Operation Chariot was now approved on paper, but transforming it into reality required a combination of nerve, precision, and cold acceptance from the men involved that many, would not return. In early March 1942, combined operations began assembling the force that would spearhead one of the most daring assaults of the entire war. At the center stood two key figures. For the naval element, Commander Robert "Red" Ryder, calm, experienced, and unflappable. For the Commandos, Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, a driven, determined leader with a reputation for clarity under fire. Both understood the truth. This was a mission designed on the edge of feasibility. The planning meetings grew intense. Inside Combined Operations Headquarters, maps and aerial photos of Saint-Nazaire were pored over with magnifying lenses. Debates erupted over routes, timing, landing points, and the precise sequence of demolitions. Mountbatten, charismatic and politically savvy, pushed hard for the raid to proceed, aware of the pressure from Churchill for bold action. But not everyone shared his confidence. Senior Admiralty officers warned that Chariot bordered on suicidal. The German defences were so thick that even approaching the estuary under darkness risked annihilation. The Commandos would have to fight their way into a fortress, destroy critical infrastructure, then somehow escape, all under fire. Yet alternatives were worse. No bombing raid could penetrate the U-boat pens. A submarine torpedo attack lacked precision. A surface strike without deception would be slaughter. And so Mountbatten's audacious proposal survived. Ram the gate, destroy the heart of the dock, escape if possible, but above all, neutralize the repair facility for Tirpitz. The naval force assembled at Falmouth was a curious mix. The aging Campbeltown, now disguised as a German vessel. 2 Hunt-class escort destroyers, HMS Atherstone and HMS Tyndale. Motor gunboat MGB 314, the headquarters ship. Motor torpedo boat MTB 74 carrying torpedoes for a secondary strike. 16 Fairmile motor launches carrying the Commandos, in all 611 men, 346 Royal Navy, 265 Commandos. They were divided into 3 main groups. Group 1, to secure the Old Mole and northern installations. Group 2, to strike southern targets. Group 3, Campbeltown's own demolition teams, tasked with destroying the dock machinery. Many were volunteers, but all understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, work continued around the clock on HMS Campbeltown. She had been stripped of excess weight, her draft lightened so she could cross the shallow mudflats on a spring tide. 3 of her 4 4-inch guns were removed. Oerlikons and 50 caliber machine guns added. Armor plating was welded onto the bridge. Splinter mattresses were lashed across her decks in a patchwork of makeshift protection. Inside her bow, the explosives, 24 Mark 7 depth charges set in concrete, formed a crude but devastating warhead. Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets, who designed the arrangement, knew he would have to activate the fuses well before impact, accepting he might never leave the ship alive. Shipyard workers sensed the ominous nature of the assignment. One remarked quietly as the funnels were reshaped, "She's for a one-way trip, that one." Even the Commandos, hardened soldiers who had seen their share of danger, paused when they first saw the transformed destroyer. Sleek, sinister, and unmistakably German in outline, she looked almost reborn, yet everyone knew what waited inside her bow. Training intensified. Demolition teams practiced blowing mock-up pump houses and winding gear. Assault troops rehearsed storming heavily defended buildings. Protection units trained to hold the perimeter around the demolition teams while they set their charges. This was not only a commando raid, it was a tightly choreographed sequence of destruction. Every man had his place. Every minute had its purpose. Captain Bill Pritchard, whose family had business ties to the dock before the war, provided invaluable technical guidance. He knew the layout, the machinery, and the critical vulnerabilities. Still, the men sensed the odds. The dry dock was surrounded by nearly 5,000 German defenders, including harbour units, infantry from the 333rd Division, and naval flak brigades. One commando later put it plainly: "We weren't expected to come back. We all knew it." On the afternoon of 26th of March 1942, at 1400 hours, the flotilla slipped from Falmouth, moving into the channel in 3 neat columns. The sea was calm, the sky overcast. Inside the mess decks, men played cards, wrote last letters, and tried to steady their nerves. By nightfall, the weather worsened, the smaller launches bucking heavily in the swell. Some men were violently seasick, others quietly reflective. A few attempted humour, most did not. They all sensed the same truth. They were going somewhere from which many would not return. As the English coast faded into darkness behind them, the greatest raid of the war was underway. Night settled over the channel as the force pressed southeast, the grey shapes of destroyers and motor launches rising and falling in the dark waters. Winds strengthened, and the smaller boats were battered by the swell. Rain came in intermittent sheets, tapping against helmets and decks in a restless rhythm. On the cramped wooden launches, the men endured a long, punishing night. Some sat silently, their thoughts drifting to home. Others clenched jaw and fist, fighting seasickness and fear. One commando later recalled, "Of all the dangers on that mission, that night's crossing was the first test, and it would not be the last." At 2100 hours, the flotilla altered course. They were now approaching hostile waters. Shortly afterwards, a silent shadow moved beneath the waves. A German U-boat, U-593, had spotted them. Her captain peered through the periscope. A scattered group of vessels, indistinct in the gloom, heading east. He marked them down as potential mine layers or a decoy group. His report to base misjudged their heading, a fortunate error that helped preserve the British deception. Still, the encounter electrified nerves across the flotilla. On board HMS Tyndale, lookouts shouted. A periscope had been spotted in the swell. The escort destroyer wheeled sharply and accelerated, depth charges tumbling into the sea in a pattern of deafening eruptions. The shockwaves rolled beneath the hulls, and for a moment, every man held his breath. But U-593 escaped into the depths, slipping away towards safety. The British force continued their approach, unharmed but acutely aware of how narrowly they had avoided early catastrophe. Shortly after 11:30 p.m. on the night of 27th March, the second part of the plan unfolded. The RAF launched a diversionary attack, 35 Whitley bombers and 27 Wellingtons. Their purpose was simple: draw every German eye skyward. But nature turned against them. A blanket of low cloud made bombing accuracy impossible. Only 4 aircraft were able to release their weapons on the port. The rest circled, releasing flares, burning precious fuel, and ultimately heightening German suspicion rather than distracting it. German gunners of the 22nd Naval Flak Brigade, under Captain José Karl Konrad Mecker, were placed on high alert. Searchlights swept the sky. The port bristled with nervous readiness. Unknowingly, the bombers had set the stage not for deception, but for the defenders' vigilance. Near midnight, the flotilla neared the Loire estuary. The waters were shallow, treacherous, with sandbanks and mudflats lying close beneath the surface. In the darkness, the crews strained their eyes for navigational markers. The S-class submarine HMS Sturgeon, positioned earlier as a beacon, radiated her guiding signal. The ships went dark, engines throttled back. German ensigns were raised. HMS Campbeltown, her silhouette altered to resemble a Meaux-class torpedo boat, now took the lead. She scraped bottom twice. Each time the shudder ran through the entire ship like a warning. But she pressed on. On her decks, men could now make out the distant shapes of bunkers, blockhouses and searchlight towers. They could sense how close they were to the jaws of the fortress. At 1:22 a.m., searchlights snapped to life. Blinding, white, merciless beams swept across the water, catching the flotilla in their glare. Every man froze for a moment. not physically but mentally, as the fragile deception was suddenly placed under intense scrutiny. A German signal flashed across the dark water. "Identify yourself." A heartbeat passed. Then another. The British replied with captured German codes, claiming to be a damaged flotilla seeking repairs. It was bold, and it worked, for the moment. German signalmen, confused by the familiar outline of the lead ship and the convincing ensigns, hesitated. Officers argued. A warning shot fired, but the British answered with a green flare and 3 red stars. More stolen signals. Those minutes felt like hours. The fate of the entire mission hung on doubt in the enemy ranks. At 1:28 a.m., the illusion broke. German guns roared into life. Batteries opened fire from every direction. Tracer fire streaked across the water. Shells hammered the sea, throwing up fountains of spray. Wooden motor launches burst into flame as steel tore through their thin hulls. The night sky became a storm of light, smoke, and deafening noise. On the bridge of Campbeltown, Commander Beatty set his jaw and shouted the order: "Lower the German flag. Raise the white ensign." The time for deception was over. Now came the dash for the gate. The moment the white ensign rose above HMS Campbeltown, the final stretch of her doom voyage began. She was now charging toward the most heavily defended harbour on the French Atlantic coast. German guns thundered from blockhouses, towers, and rooftops. Every calibre, from machine guns to coastal artillery, poured fire into the darkness. On the bridge, Commander Beatty felt the ship shudder under the onslaught. 2 helmsmen were cut down in rapid succession, thrown to the deck by a burst of shrapnel. Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, the man who had armed the explosive charge, took the wheel himself, blood streaking his face as bullets smashed against the bridge armour. Campbeltown pressed on, using the very searchlights trained upon her as navigation points. Sparks cascaded off her hull, splinters sliced through the air. Men clung to railings as the ship lurched violently with every hit. But the old destroyer, reborn as a floating bomb, refused to slow. She had one task left. Ahead loomed the massive steel wall of the caisson, thick, towering, immovable. At 1:34 a.m., travelling at 19 knots, Campbeltown struck. The impact was seismic. 36 feet of her bow crumpled instantly, shearing away as the forward section embedded itself deep into the gate. Metal tore with a screech that echoed across the port. Men were thrown off their feet. Equipment smashed against bulkheads. The deck pitched as if the ship herself gasped from the collision. Commander Beatty steadied himself and uttered a wry remark to his officers. "Well, here we are, 4 minutes late." Even in the heart of hell, the Royal Navy found room for understatement. With German fire still hammering the ship, the crew opened the seacocks, flooding the hull to ensure Campbeltown stayed wedged tight. She could not be towed off. Not now. Not ever. Her deadly cargo was in place. As Campbeltown ground to a halt, the Commandos of Group 3, led by Major William Copland, leapt into action. They scrambled over the twisted wreckage of the bow, jumping onto the caisson under fire. German machine guns raked the area, kicking up sparks along the steelwork. Captain Donald William Roy, known as the Laird, led his troop with fierce determination. 4 of his men fell almost immediately, but the survivors pressed forward, clearing gun positions and securing a foothold around the gate. Behind them, demolition teams surged toward their targets. The pump house, winding gear, and essential machinery that controlled the dock. Explosives were placed with practiced precision. Charges were armed, fuses lit, targets destroyed. The heartbeat of the dry dock was being ripped out. While Campbeltown delivered her lethal blow, the smaller motor launches attempted to land their commandos along the Old Mole and the southern basin. They steamed into a hurricane of German fire. ML192 was torn apart, leaving only 6 survivors. ML268 was hit so heavily that a single man lived to tell the tale. Several launches caught fire instantly, wooden hulls and fuel tanks transforming them into floating infernos. Only ML-457 and ML-177 succeeded in putting meaningful numbers of commandos ashore. The men who disembarked sprinted across open ground under merciless fire, throwing grenades into gun pits, seizing small vessels, and engaging defenders at close quarters. On MGB-314, the headquarters boat, the crew fought back fiercely despite repeated hits. Able seaman William Alfred Savage manned an exposed gun position with unwavering courage, firing until his weapon fell silent. He died at his post. He would later receive the Victoria Cross. Elsewhere, MTB-74, commanded by Lieutenant Wynne, pressed forward to launch her delayed action torpedoes into the old entrance. She succeeded, but took heavy damage and was lost on withdrawal. By now, St. Nazaire had erupted into chaos. Searchlights crisscrossed the night. Guns fired from rooftops, windows and fortified emplacements. Commandos and German defenders clashed in alleys and streets as the raiders attempted to reach and destroy their objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, though not meant to land this early, found himself ashore directing operations amid the confusion. He organized ad hoc groups, coordinated machine gun and mortar fire, and improvised routes through the town as original paths became untenable. Charges detonated across the port in a rolling wave of explosions. The dock mechanisms were smashed. Fuel tanks erupted in flames. German communications faltered. But every man now confronted a grim truth. Even as their objectives fell, the route home was collapsing. The old mole, intended as the evacuation point, was raked with such intense fire that no boat could approach. The sea itself seemed to burn under the tracers. The commandos were trapped inside the fortress they had just torn apart. The moment the commandos realized the old mole could not be reached, the nature of the mission changed. What had begun as a daring strike was now becoming a fight for survival. German guns, alert, coordinated, relentless, blanketed the waterfront. Any motor launch attempting to withdraw was hit almost instantly. Smoke hung thick across the harbour. The water churned with burning fuel. The sky throbbed with tracer fire. The plan for evacuation had collapsed, and the men ashore understood with an awful clarity that they were now alone. Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Newman gathered what remained of his dispersed forces. Amid shattered buildings and the glare of searchlights, he issued orders that cut through the chaos with stark resolve. Do your best to get back to England. Not to surrender until all our ammunition is exhausted. Not to surrender at all if we can help it. His words were not dramatic. They were practical, grounded in the reality facing them. Ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting, and German reinforcements were flooding into the town. Yet the commandos did not panic. They formed small fighting groups and prepared to battle their way out, street by street. The retreat through St. Nazaire became a series of brutal close-quarters engagements. Commandos charged across open roads, ducked through alleyways, smashed through doorways, and fought from room to room as German soldiers fired from balconies, windows, and rooftops. A handful of French civilians risked everything to help. Some hid raiders in their homes. Others whispered directions, offered clothing, or shared bread and water. Their gestures, quiet, courageous, became small beacons of humanity amid the chaos. Lieutenant Coran Purdon led one group that fought its way across 2 bridges, blasting through barricades, exchanging fire with German units at ranges measured in feet. They used grenades, Bren guns, and captured German weapons scavenged from the fallen. But for every breakthrough, more German troops arrived. The noose tightened. The streets became killing zones. The commandos, exhausted and bleeding, continued to fight on. By dawn, it was clear that only a handful of men would escape by land, and fewer still would reach the countryside. The majority were surrounded, forced into small pockets as ammunition dwindled. One group made a desperate attempt to reach the south side of the town. They forced their way through a garden wall, sprinted across open ground, and fought into the outskirts before sheer numbers overwhelmed them. Others were cornered near the docks, pressed against buildings that shook under the impact of gunfire. They fought until their weapons were empty. German officers later commented with astonishment on the ferocity of the British resistance. Many commandos, refusing to surrender until the last possible moment, collapsed from wounds or exhaustion before they let themselves be taken. In the end, about 100 men were taken prisoner. Some were marched through the smoking ruins of the port. Others were dragged from hiding places or rounded up in small groups. They were bruised, burned, bleeding, but alive. Most would be sent to Stalag 133, a prisoner of war camp in Brittany. From their cells they could still see the distant silhouette of HMS Campbeltown, lodged defiantly into the caisson. Inside the camp, men tried to make sense of their fate. They whispered about the demolition charges. They speculated over whether the fuses would hold. They wondered if the destroyer, battered, riddled with holes, mocked by the Germans, would still deliver her final blow. By morning on the 28th of March 1942, the guns had fallen silent. Smoke drifted across the shattered port of Nazaire. German officers walked the quayside with a confident swagger, convinced they had crushed a reckless British raid. To their eyes, the attack had failed. The commandos had been killed or captured. The harbour facilities appeared intact. The destroyer lodged in the caisson was a curiosity, a battered trophy. Several German officers climbed aboard Campbeltown, inspecting her ruined bridge and twisted decks. The ship sat high and strange, half embedded in the gate with an awkward list. Officers joked. Sailors gathered to gawp. One group posed proudly for photographs. Unseen beneath their feet, the detonators ticked softly toward their appointed hour. At German headquarters, reports summarized the night's events. Heavy British losses, minor damage to the port, no significant threat to the dry dock's integrity. Capitan Mecca of the 22nd Naval Flak Brigade dismissed the attack as a little British raid, spirited but futile. But not everyone was convinced. One German naval engineer, uneasy, noted odd reinforcements welded into the bow. Another remarked on cables and concrete protruding through torn metal plating. But in the atmosphere of triumph, and with senior officers brushing aside their concerns, no action was taken. Hubris replaced caution, and time, minute by minute, eroded what little margin the Germans had left. Just before midday, French dock workers went about their routines. German personnel relaxed on break. Officers continued their inspections aboard the grounded destroyer. The port buzzed with activity, mundane, orderly, confident. Then, at 12 p.m., HMS Campbeltown fulfilled her purpose. The explosion was colossal. 4.5 tons of depth charges, buried in concrete, concealed beneath layers of plating, detonated as one. The caisson shattered. Steel beams flew like spears. Walls collapsed. A massive plume of water and debris shot skyward, blotting out the sun. 2 tankers moored nearby were ripped apart. Buildings along the quayside shook and then crumbled. Shrapnel rained across the port. More than 360 Germans were killed instantly, including around 40 officers who had been proudly showing others the captured destroyer. The dry dock, the one facility capable of repairing Tirpitz outside Germany, was obliterated. The British prisoners in Stalag 133 felt the shockwave through the ground. Dust poured from the rafters. Tin cups rattled. One man later recalled, "We looked at each other, and without a word, we knew." For all their losses, for all their sacrifice, the raiders had won. The damage was not yet over. 2 delayed action torpedoes fired by MTB-74 into the old entrance detonated on the 30th of March, 2 days after the raid. The blasts tore through additional installations and triggered a nervous firefight when German troops mistakenly shot French workers, convinced saboteurs were still operating inside the port. Fear replaced arrogance. The Germans, once certain Saint-Nazaire was impregnable, now suspected shadows in every alley and saboteurs at every turn. The human cost of the raid was immense. Of the 612 men who set out, 169 were killed, 215 were captured, 228 returned to Britain. The losses were devastating. The courage displayed, astonishing. St. Nazaire's port lay crippled. The Normandy dry dock remained unusable until 1948. For the Germans, the psychological impact was enormous. Hitler, furious, ordered an accelerated expansion of the Atlantic Wall, diverting hundreds of thousands of troops and more than 1 million labourers to strengthen coastal defences. Every day they spent fortifying France would be one less day spent reinforcing the Eastern Front. And for Tirpitz, she never risked a deep Atlantic breakout. Denied her only repair sanctuary, she became a prisoner of the fjords, a fleet in being reduced to a fortress bound to the rocks of Norway. Strategically, the raid had changed everything. Operation Chariot became known as the greatest raid of all. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Beatty, Ryder, Newman, Savage and Durrant, alongside dozens of other decorations. Their actions inspired future amphibious operations, informed hard lessons for Dieppe and Normandy, and lifted morale throughout a Britain starving for triumph. The twisted, half-submerged wreck of Campbeltown remained visible for months, a silent monument to ingenuity, audacity, and sacrifice. Even the Germans could not deny it. One officer later wrote, "They came in the night, they broke our fortress, and they left us in ruins." In the days and weeks that followed the raid on St. Nazaire, the tides washed through the ruins of the shattered harbour. Debris drifted along the quayside. The air carried the smell of oil, scorched metal, and a silence unfamiliar to a port once alive with German confidence. Where once stood the pride of Germany's Atlantic repair capability, there was now only wreckage, and at the heart of it, lodged into the remains of the caisson, lay the twisted hull of HMS Campbeltown, her bow torn open, her mission complete. The sea rolled gently against her shattered frame, indifferent, yet eternal. For the French civilians of St. Nazaire, the sight of the wreck carried mixed emotions. Sorrow for those killed, grief for the reprisals that followed, but pride too, quiet, defiant pride, that the Allies had dared to strike at the very heart of the German war machine. For the occupying forces, it was a humiliation, a blow not merely to steel, but to prestige. For the British prisoners held in Stalag 133, life settled into the rhythm of captivity. They survived on meagre rations, endured interrogations, and waited for news of home. But they carried with them something the Germans could not take away, the knowledge that their mission had succeeded. Tirpitz never made a decisive breakout into the ocean. She remained bottled up in Norwegian fjords, a threat in theory but increasingly a burden in practice. The Royal Navy and RAF dedicated enormous effort to contain her, attacks by midget submarines, aerial raids, torpedo strikes, until at last, on the 12th of November 1944, RAF Lancasters sank her in Tromsø fjord. Many factors contributed to her demise, but Operation Chariot had sealed her strategic fate years earlier. The dry dock at St. Nazaire had been the key, and the men of Campbeltown had broken it beyond repair. When the war ended, the people of St. Nazaire placed a plaque on the quayside to honour the British raiders. The dry dock was eventually rebuilt, but its story, its moment in history, was never forgotten. In Britain, memorials rose in Falmouth, in London, and in the hometowns of the fallen. Veterans of the raid, those few who survived captivity and returned home, spoke modestly of what they had done. They did not call themselves heroes. They said only that they had done their duty. But history remembers more. Operation Chariot became etched into the annals of the Second World War as a testament to ingenuity, courage, and sacrifice. a daring strike that defied the odds and reshaped the course of the naval war. The sea eventually claimed what remained of HMS Campbeltown. Her steel rusted, the tides shifted, the harbour changed, but the legacy endures. For in the dark hours of one March night in 1942, a worn-out destroyer and a few hundred determined men achieved the impossible.